Mama's coming back, she promised. Isabelle's voice cracked through the roar of the Paris metro, her small hands clutching her sister as if the world would rip them apart. A businessman brushed past without looking, his leather shoes splashing through the rising water, while Claire's thin frame shivered under a soaked blanket. And then a man in a drenched suit dropped to his knees before them, eyes blazing with both fury and grief. "No child should ever have to wait this long," he whispered, tears mixing with the storm. "Tell me, if you were standing there, what would you do? The Paris metro never sleeps. Trains thunder through its tunnels, crowds rise and fall like waves, and yet in the chaos there are corners so still they become invisible. On one of those forgotten benches at Gare du Nord, two little girls sat each night as if the world had placed them there to be overlooked. Isabelle was 8, her hair tied in a crooked braid she had clearly done herself. Claire was 6 smaller, clinging to her sister's hand, with a loyalty too heavy for her age. Their shoes were scuffed, their coats thin, but their eyes watched everything with quiet discipline. They were sentinels of survival in a city that never noticed. Alexander Grant noticed. He was not a man who typically strayed from his routine. His life was governed by precision morning runs along the Seine, conference calls, timed to the second dinners at the same restaurant where no one dared disturb him. He was a billionaire born of relentless work and sharper instincts, a man who had learned that control was the only defense against chaos. But something about the sisters unsettled him. The first night, he assumed they were waiting for someone. The second, he thought perhaps their mother was a late-night worker. By the third, when he saw them again in the exact same place, at the exact same time, he felt the rhythm of his orderly world shift. Each evening, at precisely 6:40, Isabelle and Claire appeared as if summoned by an invisible clock. They carried a worn backpack between them, too small to hold much, and sat close enough that their knees touched. They rarely spoke, but once in a while Isabelle hummed a tune soft and steady while Claire leaned against her shoulder. It was not a melody of joy, but of comfort, something passed down like a memory of warmth in the cold stone of the metro. Commuters brushed by their eyes, sliding over the girls without pause. For Alexander, who had spent a lifetime constructing glass walls between himself and the rest of humanity, the girls' invisibility was impossible to ignore. He began to notice the details. One night, Isabelle broke a cookie in half, giving the larger piece to Claire, before nibbling on the smaller one herself. Another time, Claire dozed off, and Isabelle tucked their thin blanket around her, her small face set in a seriousness far too old for her years. There was discipline in the way they moved, patience in the way they waited. Yet the question pressed harder each night: what were they waiting for? And why was no one else asking? Alexander was not a sentimental man, but memories began to surface against his will. He recalled the sting of cold floors in the Glasgow orphanage where he had spent his earliest years, the way children clung to rituals, because rituals meant order, and order meant hope. He had buried those memories beneath skyscrapers and billions, yet here they were, resurrected by 2 little girls on a train bench thousands of miles from his past. The contrast rattled him. He had built his empire to erase the feeling of helplessness. Yet, watching the sisters, he felt helpless again. One evening, he left a bored dinner early, claiming fatigue, though he rarely admitted weakness. Instead, he found himself back at Gare du Nord, standing in the shadows observing. Rain streaked the glass doors, and inside the station the girls huddled together, their blanket drawn tight. Claire's head rested on Isabelle's lap, and Isabelle's lips moved soundlessly, whispering a lullaby into the noise of rushing trains. For reasons he could not articulate, Alexander's chest tightened. He had faced hostile takeovers, international crises, financial collapses without blinking. But here he stood paralyzed by 2 children who did not even know his name, The decision to approach them came not from logic, but from something older, something that belonged to the boy he once was. He sat on the bench opposite them, careful not to startle. Isabel's eyes flicked toward him sharp and guarded. Claire stirred but did not wake. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low and steady. "You're here every night," he said, not as an accusation, but as a confession. Why, Isabel studied him for a long moment, weighing whether to answer. Then, with a gravity beyond her years, she spoke. "We're waiting for Mama. She said she'd be back. It's been 4 days." Her words landed like a stone in his chest. 4 days. He felt the familiar echo of a promise never kept, of a door that never opened. In that moment, the billionaire who thought he had outgrown his past felt it crash into him all over again. He nodded slowly, unable to trust his voice. The weight of her answer settled between them, heavier than the crowd, heavier than the trains. He had come looking for an explanation, but what he found was recognition. These girls were not strangers. They were the reflection of a boy who once waited for someone who never returned. And for the first time in decades, Alexander Grant felt his composure fracture. The morning after that first fragile exchange, Alexander could not push the girls from his mind. He had returned to his penthouse overlooking the Seine, but the silence there felt different now. It was not the calm he once craved, but a void that pressed in on him. He rose early as always, suited up, reviewed numbers and projections, but his focus was fractured. Somewhere in the city, Isabelle and Claire were waking to the same harsh reality they had endured for days, and he could not pretend the knowledge belonged to someone else. By mid-morning, Alexander found himself back near Gare du Nord. He had no meeting there, no reason that would pass for rational explanation, yet his driver received no instructions to go elsewhere. He carried a paper bag from a bakery along the boulevard, still warm with croissants and hot chocolate. When he stepped into the station, he spotted them instantly. They were perched on their bench, Isabelle brushing her sister's hair with her fingers, Claire leaning into the touch. For a moment he stood still, caught between the sharp memory of his own childhood hunger and the awkwardness of intruding. Then he moved forward. "Good morning," he said, placing the bag gently on the bench beside them. Isabelle eyed it with suspicion, her hand tightening protectively on her sister's shoulder. "It's just food," Alexander added, his voice even. "No strings." Claire, too young to mask her yearning, peeked at the bag with wide eyes. Isabelle hesitated before pulling it closer, unwrapping the croissants with deliberate slowness. She broke one in half and passed the larger piece to Claire, keeping the smaller for herself. Alexander felt the gesture strike something deep in him, the same protective instinct he had once watched in older children at the orphanage who rationed scraps to shield the younger ones. He swallowed the lump in his throat as Claire bit into the pastry and closed her eyes, as though it was the finest meal she had ever tasted. They ate in silence at first. Alexander did not rush them. He had spent a life buying speed and efficiency, but this moment demanded patience. When Claire finally looked up, chocolate staining her lip, she whispered a soft, "Thank you." Isabelle followed with a wary nod, her eyes still sharp, but no longer closed. It was the smallest of openings, but it was an opening nonetheless. He asked their names, and they answered with hesitant voices. Isabelle precise and firm. Claire softer, almost musical. He told them his name, not the public version associated with wealth and companies, but simply Alexander, spoken plainly. It seemed to surprise Isabelle, as if she expected titles and demands. For the first time her posture softened. As the morning crowd surged and thinned, Alexander stayed. He listened more than he spoke, letting the sisters guide the fragments of conversation. They told him they had a mother named Elise, who left promising food and had not returned. Isabelle insisted she would come back, her tone fierce while Claire's silence suggested doubt she was too loyal to voice. The ache in Alexander's chest deepened. Their words carried him back to the nights he had waited for his own mother to reclaim him, rehearsing explanations in his head, believing each sound at the door might be hers. He had learned too soon how cruel waiting could be. Yet here before him were two children who still carried the weight of that hope. He could not shatter it, but he could not ignore it either. Instead, he shifted the subject gently. "Do you go to school?" he asked. Isabelle shook her head. Claire leaned closer, whispering, "We read sometimes. Mama taught us." From her backpack, Isabelle produced a tattered children's book, its pages worn but treasured. She held it like an artifact proof of a world that still belonged to them. Alexander offered to read. At first, Isabelle resisted, but curiosity won. He read aloud, his deep voice echoing against the tiled walls of the station. Claire leaned forward, her eyes wide, while Isabelle studied him, as if deciding whether the story sounded different in his mouth. When he finished, Claire clapped softly, giggling, and for the first time since he had met her, Alexander saw joy unburden her face. The sound startled him. It was so small, yet it cracked open a space in the air, space that felt like possibility. Around them, unnoticed by most others, had been watching. The florist who sold blooms outside the station paused to observe. The guard who made his nightly rounds lingered near. Even the violinist who played by the stairwell slowed his bow, his melody softening. Alexander realized then that the sisters were not only invisible to strangers, they were quietly cherished by those who had glimpsed their endurance. He was not the only one who had noticed, but perhaps he was the only one with the means to change their story. As the hours stretched, his phone buzzed with reminders of meetings he was supposed to attend, calls he was meant to lead. He silenced it without answering. The world could wait. For once, the weight of obligation did not feel like duty but distraction. His mind turned to the choice forming inside him. Social services could be called, donations could be made, but as he looked at Isabelle's guarded determination and Claire's fragile trust, he knew those options would not be enough. That afternoon he instructed his driver to clear his calendar, canceling an investor meeting worth millions. His assistant questioned the decision, bewildered. He offered no explanation. The truth was one he could barely admit to himself. For the first time in years he felt pulled by something stronger than profit, stronger than reputation. As dusk fell, he returned to the metro. The sisters were there as they always were, the city rushing around them in indifference. This time, he did not stand in the shadows. He walked straight to their bench, carrying another bag of food, and sat down beside them. The world he had built on precision and control was beginning to bend. And though he could not see its full shape yet, he knew one thing with certainty: he would not walk away. The storm arrived without warning, sweeping across Paris with a violence that made the city feel smaller and more fragile than usual. By late afternoon, the wind clawed at the boulevards, rattling shutters and bending the trees along the Seine. Alexander sat in his office, high above the city glass walls, trembling under the pounding rain. His team urged him to stay, cancel appointments, wait it out. But his thoughts were not with markets or meetings. They were fixed on two children who at that very moment were likely huddled on a cold bench inside the metro as the water rose and the world shook. By the time he ordered his driver to take him to Gare du Nord, the streets were flooding. Traffic stalled, horns blared, and yet Alexander insisted they keep going. When the car could go no further, he stepped into the storm himself, rain slamming against his tailored coat shoes, sinking into rushing gutters. He pushed through the crowd of commuters pouring out of the metro, their umbrellas flipping inside out, their voices frantic. He ignored them all, moving against the current down the stairs into the station. The sight froze him. Water seeped through cracks in the tiled walls, pooling across the floor. Lights flickered overhead. And there on their familiar bench were Isabelle and Claire, clutching their backpack, fear flickering across their faces, for the first time since he had known them. Isabelle held her sister close, whispering something to calm her, though her own eyes betrayed panic. Alexander crossed the station in a rush. "We have to go," he said, his voice firm but not harsh. Isabelle shook her head instinctively, clutching Claire tighter. "Mama might come back. She won't find us if we leave." The words cut through him, but there was no time to argue. A surge of water rolled across the floor, forcing Claire to cry out. Alexander knelt, looking Isabelle straight in the eye. "Your mother would want you safe. You can't stay here, not tonight." His conviction steadied her more than the storm did. Slowly, reluctantly, she let him lift Claire into his arms. With his free hand, he guided Isabelle, who clutched the blanket and backpack as if they were lifelines. The climb back to the street was chaos, people rushing alarms, sounding rain pouring in sheets. Alexander shielded the girls with his body, pushing through until they emerged onto the boulevard. The driver, drenched, held the car door open. They tumbled inside, water dripping from their clothes, their breaths quick and uneven. For the first time since he had met them, Isabelle leaned into him not out of suspicion but out of surrender, the weight of responsibility too great for her small shoulders. When the car reached his residence, the storm had not lessened. Lightning cracked across the Paris sky as he ushered them into the mansion. The sudden shift was overwhelming the marble floors, gleaming the vast staircase sweeping upward, the warmth of lights that had never felt necessary until now. Claire clung to his hand wide-eyed, while Isabelle stood stiff, unsure if safety could be trusted when it looked so much like a dream. He led them to a guest suite where staff rushed in with towels and blankets. The girls resisted at first, unused to anyone fussing over them, but exhaustion won. They were bathed, their hair brushed out, their thin clothes replaced with soft pajamas that hung loose but warm. When they emerged, they looked smaller, fragile, but clean, their cheeks flushed from the heat of water and soap. Alexander stood in the doorway watching as they explored the room. A bed larger than both of them combined a window that framed the storm without letting it in. "Is this ours?" Claire whispered. Isabelle's lips pressed tight, not ready to believe. Alexander crouched to meet their eyes. "For tonight, yes, and for as long as you need." It was not a promise he had planned to make, but the words carried their own truth. Dinner was simple soup and bread brought up from the kitchen. To the sisters, it was a feast. They ate slowly, at first glancing at him as though worried the offer might be withdrawn. When it wasn't, Claire began to chatter in small bursts, between bites stories about songs their mother used to sing. Isabelle remained quiet, but the hard line of her shoulders softened. After the meal, Alexander showed them the music room. A grand piano sat beneath a chandelier, polished but rarely touched. Claire ran to it instantly, pressing a key with one finger, giggling at the sound. Isabelle joined her, hesitant at first, then braver, picking out a rhythm while Claire hummed. Alexander, awkward and unfamiliar, sat beside them and struck a note of his own. The sound was clumsy, discordant, but it made Claire laugh so hard she nearly toppled off the bench. Isabelle looked at him sideways, her lips twitching toward a smile she tried to hide. The storm outside raged on, but within those walls something shifted. It was not charity, it was not obligation, it was the fragile beginning of belonging. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the cold edges of his home thaw. The mansion, once a fortress of solitude, now echoed with the uncertain, hopeful music of children. When it was time to sleep, he tucked the blanket they had carried from the metro at the foot of their bed. Isabelle laid it carefully across her sister before slipping under the covers herself. The fabric was worn thin, but it mattered. It was a thread connecting their past to whatever came next. Standing at the doorway, Alexander felt a weight settle over him, heavier than any corporate deal or global crisis. He was responsible now, not just for shelter or food, but for lives already woven into his own. Long after the girls had drifted into sleep, he remained in the hall listening to the storm subside. He knew the world outside would soon demand explanations, schedules, decisions. But here, in this moment, all that mattered was that two little girls were safe, and he was no longer the man who could turn away. Morning light spilled into the vast Parisian mansion, illuminating spaces that had once stood silent. Now they carried traces of life, two pairs of small slippers by the door, a child's drawing taped unevenly to the refrigerator, the faint echo of laughter down the hall. Alexander had spent years building an empire that demanded precision, order, and control. But in just weeks, Isabelle and Claire had introduced something new, a kind of beautiful chaos that he realized he'd been craving all along. The routine began to form almost naturally. Breakfast was no longer a solitary affair taken over a newspaper. It became eggs scrambled in too much butter, Claire insisting on adding sugar to her milk, Isabelle carefully slicing fruit, as though the task carried the weight of responsibility. Alexander discovered that children didn't eat in silence. They filled the room with questions, with chatter about the colors of the sunrise or the dream they had last night. It unsettled him at first, but then it settled into him, warming corners of his life that had been cold for too long. Isabelle, older by only a few years, but carrying the weight of an adult, often tried to keep control, reminding her sister to wash hands, to sit straight, to finish her food. Alexander recognized himself in her, the instinct to manage, to protect, to stay one step ahead of disappointment. And yet, in rare moments, he would catch her smile while reading a new book he had placed on her nightstand, or hear her laugh quietly at one of Claire's wild stories. These glimpses of the child she still was gave him hope that the heavy armor she wore might not be permanent. Claire, on the other hand, embraced the new world with open arms. She ran through the marble halls as though they were playgrounds, named every painting on the walls, and adopted a golden cushion as her throne. Her innocence carried a kind of bravery. She trusted, easily loved openly, and in doing so softened the edges of everyone around her, especially Alexander. He tried at first to keep work and home separate, but the two worlds began to bleed together. Meetings were scheduled earlier so he could be home in time for dinner. He started declining evening galas that once seemed mandatory, choosing instead to sit on the living room floor, playing cards with the girls. His staff whispered about the change, the man who once measured life in minutes now, surrendering hours to bedtime stories. For Alexander, it wasn't sacrifice. It was freedom. Yet beneath the surface, a question gnawed at him. Where was their mother? Isabelle still carried the conviction that she might return. Sometimes Alexander found her at the window, watching the street below, her expression unreadable. He didn't want to steal that hope, but he also knew the ache of waiting for someone who would never come. He had lived that story himself, sitting by doors that never opened, watching clocks tick past promises broken. He hired an investigator quietly, giving only fragments of information, determined to find answers for the girls, even if the truth was difficult. As weeks passed, small traditions took root. Friday nights became movie nights, complete with popcorn spilling across the couch. Sundays were for walks along the Seine. Claire holding his hand and skipping ahead. Isabelle walking slightly behind, guarded but present. On one of those walks, Claire pointed at a family picnicking on the grass and asked, "Is that what we are now?" Alexander froze, unsure how to answer. Before he could find the words, Isabelle replied softly, "We're something." It was not a denial, and it was not acceptance, but it was a step. Moments of tenderness often arrived unexpectedly. One evening, after a particularly long day, Alexander fell asleep in the armchair. He woke to find a blanket draped over him and two small notes on the table, one from Claire with a crooked heart, and the words, "Good night," and another from Isabelle with a single line, "Thank you for staying." He read it again and again, realizing it was more than politeness. It was trust, something she had never given lightly. Still, doubt lingered. Was he doing enough? Could he, a man who had lived so long in isolation, really provide what they needed? The mansion was full of comforts, but children needed more than toys or fine meals. They needed presence, consistency, love. On nights when the girls were asleep, he sat in his study, wrestling with the weight of responsibility. Yet each morning, when Claire ran to him shouting his name, and Isabelle handed him coffee just the way he liked it, he felt the answer rising in him, yes, he could. The first time Isabelle called him Papa, it was almost accidental. She had been scolding Claire for spilling juice, frustration spilling over, when she turned and said, "Papa, tell her she can't keep doing this." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Isabelle's eyes widened, realizing what she had said, and for a moment she seemed ready to retreat back into silence. But Alexander, swallowing the sudden lump in his throat, simply nodded and said, "She's right, Claire. And you have to be more careful." And just like that, the word remained. As the seasons shifted, so did their lives. The guest room transformed into their room walls, once bare, now covered with drawings, photographs, and shelves lined with books and toys. Claire's laughter filled the halls at all hours, and Isabelle began to let herself dream aloud about school, about becoming a writer, about one day seeing the world beyond the metro station. The mansion no longer felt like a monument to one man's success. It felt like a home shaped not by architecture but by the people within it. Against the odds, against the loneliness that had defined him, Alexander was no longer alone. Two sisters who had once lived in shadows now lit his days with purpose. What began as a chance encounter had become something unshakable. Not perfection, not without challenges, but real, a family forming in the unlikeliest of places, held together by the simple, stubborn act of choosing each other day after day. Autumn settled over Paris with its golden leaves and crisp air, and life in the mansion had settled into something that felt both ordinary and extraordinary. Breakfasts, together evenings filled with homework and stories, quiet laughter echoing through halls that once stood silent. Yet beneath that routine, Alexander knew a question lingered unspoken, but present: was this temporary, or would he choose to make it forever? The investigator he had hired months earlier finally returned with a report. It was thin, almost empty. No trace of the girl's mother. No records in schools, no reports in hospitals, no sign of her in shelters. It was as though she had vanished into the city's shadows. Alexander read the file late at night in his study, his hands tightening on the pages. Relief and sorrow collided inside him. Relief because no one would suddenly appear to take the girls away. Sorrow because they deserved answers and there were none. Closing the file, he whispered to the quiet room, "They need more than waiting. They need a father." The decision was made the next morning. Over breakfast, while Claire giggled over spilled jam and Isabelle carefully folded her napkin, Alexander cleared his throat. His voice, usually steady in boardrooms, wavered now. "Girls, I want to ask you something important." They looked at him, Isabelle wary, Claire curious. "Would you want me to be your father, not just in this house, but officially, legally, forever?" For a moment there was silence. Claire broke it first, climbing onto his lap with all the blunt honesty of a child. "You already are," she said, her arms wrapping around his neck. Isabelle's gaze was sharper, full of questions she didn't voice right away. Finally, she asked softly, "What if Mama comes back?" Alexander's chest ached at the words. "If she does, we'll face it together," he said gently. Being my daughter's won't erase who she is. It just means you'll never be without someone to come home to." Isabelle studied him for a long time, her young face carrying the weight of years she should never have had to bear. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "I think I'd like that." The weeks that followed were full of paperwork interviews and visits from social workers. Marianne, the assigned caseworker, arrived one Saturday morning, her eyes taking in every detail of the transformed mansion. The girls showed her their room with its pirate-themed bed for Isabelle and princess canopy for Claire. They proudly pointed to the refrigerator covered in their drawings and to the corner where they had built a reading tent. Marianne watched Alexander quietly as the girls chattered. Later, when they were out of earshot, she said, "I've seen many homes. This is more than shelter. This is love." The day of the hearing arrived with unexpected weight. They walked together into the family court building, Isabelle holding Alexander's hand with unusual firmness, Claire skipping slightly at his other side. Inside the courtroom, the judge asked questions meant to test, but the answers came easily. Claire declared she wanted pancakes forever and ever, and that only Alexander knew how to make them just right. Isabelle, more solemn, told the judge he keeps his promises. "That's how I know he'll stay." When the papers were signed, the girls became Isabelle and Claire Dubois Marchand, carrying both their mother's surname and Alexander's. It was not erasing, but adding honoring where they had come from while embracing where they were going. The judge looked over the bench and said simply, "Congratulations, you are now a family in the eyes of the law." Tears blurred Alexander's vision as the girls flung their arms around him. In that moment, the years of silence, of empty rooms and lonely nights crumbled away. The weight of his empire, the billions that once defined him, meant little compared to the small hands clinging to him now. He wasn't just a billionaire, wasn't just a man who had built companies. He was a father. Life after that didn't transform. Overnight, it deepened. The mornings still began with spilled milk and mismatched socks. Evenings still ended with stories read under blankets, but everything carried a new permanence. School forms listed his name as father. Medical files did the same. Teachers greeted him as Claire's dad and Isabelle's dad. The mansion no longer felt like his alone, it was theirs, filled with their voices, their belongings, their future. One evening, as the first snow of winter fell softly against the windows, Isabelle asked a question that stilled him. "When did you know you wanted us?" Alexander thought for a long moment before answering. "The night of the storm," he said finally. "When you trusted me enough to come with me. That's when I knew I couldn't let you go." Isabelle nodded slowly, a small smile curving her lips. "I knew too," she said, "because Mama always left. But you came back." Claire, half asleep beside them, mumbled, "Always come back." Alexander kissed their foreheads, his throat tight. Always, he promised. And he meant it. Months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, the three of them sat together in the kitchen, making pancakes. Flour dusted the counter. Claire insisted on pouring too many chocolate chips, and Isabelle teased Alexander about his uneven flipping technique. Outside, the city hummed as it always had, but inside, something extraordinary lived in the ordinary. A man once defined by wealth and solitude was now defined by something far greater. Love chosen, love fought, for love made permanent. The choice of forever wasn't about papers signed in court or names written on forms. It was about mornings like this, about promises kept, about the certainty that no storm, no absence, no waiting could undo what they had built together. And as Alexander looked across the table at his daughters, laughter spilling like sunlight into the room, he understood that he had not just saved them. They had saved him too. The story of Alexander, Isabelle, and Claire is not one of sudden miracles, but of slow, deliberate choices that reshaped 3 lives. What began on a cold Paris platform where 2 little girls waited faithfully for a mother who would never return grew into something larger than survival. It became a testament to love chosen, not given by blood, and the power of presence over absence. Alexander was a man who once measured life by meetings, profits, and routines carved into stone. To the world, he was powerful, untouchable, and endlessly wealthy. Yet behind the gates of his mansion he lived in silence, surrounded by everything except the one thing he could not buy: connection. The day he first saw Isabelle and Claire, small and invisible to the rushing crowd, something cracked within him. Their waiting mirrored his own, a reminder of a boy who once sat in the shadows of abandonment. That recognition became the thread that pulled him toward them even when reason told him to look away. The storm was the turning point. In that chaos, when the metro flooded and fear finally showed in the sisters' eyes, Alexander made a choice that no business deal had ever demanded: to stay, to risk, to fight for 2 children who were not his. That night, his mansion, long a fortress of emptiness, transformed into shelter. The girls, wrapped in borrowed pajamas, bathed and fed, filled those halls with sounds they had never known before: laughter, music, arguments over chocolate chips and pancakes. And Alexander, for the first time in decades, felt what it meant to come home. But building a family was not easy. Isabelle's trust had to be earned one promise at a time, one steady action after another. Claire's innocence brought light, but even her joy was fragile, rooted in years of loss. Alexander wrestled with doubts. Was he enough? Could he give them what their mother could not? Yet each day the answer became clearer, not in grand gestures but in the quiet rhythm of life. Movie nights, shared meals, schoolwork spread across the kitchen table. The real miracle was not in one dramatic moment, but in the simple consistency of choosing to stay. When the investigation revealed nothing of their mother's whereabouts, a truth settled heavy in the air. The waiting had to end. And so, Alexander took another step, one that required courage of a different kind. He stood before the law not as a billionaire, not as a man known for control, but as a father asking to make his daughters official. The court recognized what had already been built in love: Isabelle and Claire Dubois-Marchand, children not of chance, but of choice. That was the moment the circle closed. No longer invisible girls on a bench. No longer a man defined by loneliness. They had become a family bound not by obligation but by devotion. Forever was no longer a hope. It was a decision signed in ink and sealed in the daily proof of belonging. And what lesson do we take from their story? That love is not about perfection, nor about waiting for someone to come back and make things whole. Love is the courage to step forward when no one else will. It is the power to choose presence, to stay even when life has taught you to leave. Many of us carry wounds from promises broken, from people who walked away. The temptation is to close ourselves off, to live behind walls. But Alexander's journey shows us that healing does not come from waiting for the past to return. It comes from building new bonds, opening the door even when it feels safer to stay alone. In our own lives, we may not be billionaires or guardians of abandoned children, but we are surrounded by chances to step in, to notice the invisible, to offer consistency where the world has given instability, to understand that sometimes the most profound wealth is not measured in money or success, but in the lives we touch, the people we choose to stay with. So, ask yourself, where can you be present today? Who in your life needs more than words? Who needs to know you'll stay not just once, but every single day? It might be your family, a friend, or even a stranger whose pain mirrors your own. The choice of forever is not made once in a courtroom. It is made every morning when we decide to love again and again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of love chosen over loneliness, I invite you to be part of this journey with us. Subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and help us bring more stories that touch hearts and inspire hope. Your support is what keeps this community alive, and together we can spread the reminder that even in a world full of absence, we all have the power to stay.